But the following year, we kind of ramped it up and we budgeted to actually film the Strictly Come Dancing final in 3D. And then we negotiated with the cinemas and sort of made it a bigger piece from there. So it was an ambition for about 2 years, I think, to do a full Strictly show in 3D.
Okay, so did it change from your original idea? You know, what happened? What did you have to do internally within the BBC to make it happen?
Well, quite a lot, really. I think actually technically doing the 3D promo kind of brought all the production team on board. So everyone thought that we could do it, and it looked good, and all the dancers were quite excited by it. And so I think we kind of sort of managed to tick that box. But actually we had to jump through quite a few hoops with editorial policy and fair trading to actually get it into cinemas, firstly. I know we're going to come on to what kind of model that was, but there was a lot of complexity around that. And just kind of age groups, everything around EdPol, really. So they were the biggest hurdles that we had to kind of jump over. I mean, obviously, the budget was the first one that we had to get through.
Okay. And
we went over.
Okay. So what were the different departments then that you had to work with within the BBC?
Well, once we got it off the ground, we sort of set up as more of a project. And we had sort of distribution for the transmission side, marketing, we had all the comms for the BBC as well, and publicity. And they're normally departments which you don't have to bring on board for any show. They kind of happen as business as usual, really. So because it was the 3D, we had sort of inform more people than we would normally have to do for a normal 2D production.
Okay. And yes, talking about the cinemas then, how did that work? What did you have to do? Did you have to try and persuade them to take it? What was the process?
Well, for about 2 years, most of the cinemas have been calling us up saying, you know, what shows might you do in 3D? We'd already done Wimbledon 3D, which went to quite a few Odeon cinemas and Apollo cinemas. We spoke to Sony, we kind of spoke to some distributors, and really Odeon and Apollo sort of came forward, and I think we started off with 8 screens between the two of them, and then they sold out, I think, in the first week of tickets going on sale, and then we added another 9 screens or something over the duration, so it ended up being 19 or something.
Okay, and so were you involved in any of the ticketing or the
yeah,
kind of
so we set up with Odeon and Apollo a kind of cost recovery basis for the ticket sales. We decided that we didn't want to give the tickets away for free, because most TV shows where tickets are free, you have to oversubscribe by about 3 or 4 times. We weren't particularly worried about Strictly, but it was the Saturday before Christmas, could be really cold, bad weather. So we sort of wanted to create an obligation that people would go. And I think setting a precedent to actually charge for tickets was better than not. But we, as part of our policy, had to ask the cinemas to demonstrate that it was cost recovery. So we had to go through all their sort of fixed costs and exactly how much the night would cost, would actually sort of cost them to do, and how it would become cost recovery. So it was quite hard for the cinemas because they were putting it on, and then we were expecting them to deliver all this additional information, which they're not used to doing.
No, sure. Okay, so in terms of the production then, now, can you tell us about how shooting in 3D for that show changed the 2D show, or what impact did it have, or how did it work, the 3D and the 2D together?
We ended up, I think, with about 8 or 9 3D positions. And there's 13 2D camera positions. We shared the main Steadicam, which was a 3D Steadicam, and they took the left eye basically just for the 2D transmission. And actually, when you watch any of Strictly and the dancers, the Steadicam is pretty much in 50% of each dance. So to actually have that as a 2D camera and then converts 3D wouldn't really have been acceptable. So we shared that position. We had a new innovation, really, which was on the Technocrane. We had 3 cameras. So we had 1 camera for the 2D production, then the 2 cameras side by side for 3D. Slight issues with miniaturization on that. So next time we try to push it to actually get a mirror rig on there as well. But it was kind of the 2D production team were really nervous about sharing too many positions. And I think possibly we could share maybe 2 more, 3 more for the next one, but really we pretty much got it right. Quite a lot of issues around space on the floor, on the dance floor as well. So sort of we had to be really careful that 3D camera positions didn't knock into the 2D positions. So there was a bit of compromise there.
Okay, and what about rehearsal time and those?
Nothing was factored in for 3D. So we had to morph into the 2D rehearsal schedule. Obviously, we got there a day or 2 earlier than the 2D cameras got there, so the rigging went on longer. There was no additional rehearsals for 3D, so we just had to sort of fit into the 2D schedule, which was really, really tight. And it was great, actually, because the stereographer, Adam Sculthorpe, wrote in a report at the end, next time round, it would be really good if we had more time. So, which is brilliant. But obviously, next time round, we'll probably never have any more time.
No. So, I mean, so why was that? Was that just because, was it because the 2D show is the most important? Was it viewed as being more important?
It was, yeah. Although it was because it's 30 million, it's the highest rating show that goes out at that time, you know, so that's one of the reasons. But I actually think the dynamic probably will change if we were to do it again this year. I think that just the whole buzz around it going into cinemas, going out on the HD channel, it got the highest ratings, you know, to date for 3D on a terrestrial channel. So I think this time round everyone will be willing to sort of help 3D a bit more.
Okay. In terms of the direction of it, you know, did you had a 3D director and a 2D?
We did.
Director?
We had Marcus, who actually directed the 3D. It was absolutely fantastic. And he basically, I think, say on each dance there was 40 cuts in 2D. I think it was almost half that in 3D. So he worked really closely with the 2D director, and they scripted everything. There was lots of meetings beforehand. He talked about all the camera positions that he wanted. And slowly but surely, the 2D team agreed to it. And then he worked very closely with the 2D director.
Okay, and were there title sequences?
Title sequences, yes, which were remade in 3D. So it was interesting, actually. We mirrored the 2D versions. We got them made in 3D, but they weren't. In fact, next time I think we tinker with them, because just kind of morphing into making the 3D graphics exactly the same as the 2D didn't always work. So sort of we had quite a bit of blurring sometimes, and I think it was just an effect they used in the 2D, which they morphed directly into the 3D, which didn't quite work.
Okay.
So I think we'd probably look more into the graphics for the next time. In fact, it is definitely something that Adam, the stereographer, said to me, we need to spend more time on the graphics, and it was one of the things we sort of cut, really, but next time round it might not be.
Okay. Do you think it would be a good idea to look at the clip now? We've got a clip for everybody, so if we can roll that, please. Okay, so if we've got more time at the end, we might like to try and see a bit of the dancing as well. I don't know if we can do that, if we can play the tape a bit and get a dance. Okay, fantastic though. I'd quite like to open it up to the floor now for any questions about the show that anybody may have. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, there's one over there.
I wondered how the 2D crew responded to the 3D and whether they're now interested in doing it too.
Were the 2D crew interested in the 3D?
Yes.
Yeah.
In certain positions, yes. And I think that quite a few of the cameramen had actually worked on quite a lot of 3D. However, and I probably think the 2D director as well probably would have liked to have directed the 3D. Sorry, Marcus, but they've been working on Strictly for 8-9 series, so I think there's a lot of loyalty to working on the main show. But yes, they were all keen. They were all sort of wanting to know what's going on and having a play.
Any more questions? There's one here. It's just a,
Productions going
it's
forward
just a
with
mic
the-
coming.
Oh, okay. Commercially, going forward, how do you see productions working with the BBC? Is it going to be that you cover the production costs through cinema revenue?
Well, that's quite interesting, actually. I don't think there's, at the moment, the strategy for the BBC is that it will do some trials and experimentation with 3D over the next year. So it's going to pick sort of 4 or 5 different projects, of which Strictly was the first. BBC can't actually make money from the cinema distribution. There is potentially the possibility that Worldwide could handle the distribution, as, you know, on behalf of the BBC. So that is an obvious route that would pay for the 3D. But just how we crack it is still being worked on.
So you talk about there will be more productions over the next year
Yes.
in 3D. Can you tell us any more about any of that?
We haven't firmed that much up, apart from we're going to be doing something for the Olympics, around the Olympics, and we are looking at some comedy drama. So the idea of the experimentation is to look across different genres, so to sort of see how it works in other areas.
Great, interesting. There's a question at the front.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Rachel, where is the BBC going strategically, big picture stuff with 3D? Because let's be honest, they're after being at the front of the pack with every technical development in the last, well, since the television began, the BBC, frankly, is miles behind B Sky B now.
Yes, well, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, B Sky B having launched its own channel, there is no proposal at the moment for the BBC to launch a 3D channel. It is still during the phase of experimentation. This had to be signed off by the BBC Trust in order just to do this. So there are a few of us within the BBC that are really pushing 3D. And we really need to, I think, try and find some sort of commercial model that can run alongside, so trying to get Worldwide involved to sort of financially help that. But some 3D is just expensive. And it's an added on top of the main 2D show. I think in some areas, maybe some comedy and drama will be able to run it alongside, and the uplift will not be as much. But I think on something like Strictly, you're running another OB, it's becoming quite expensive. And you're absolutely right. I mean, personally, you feel that there should be another sort of 6 months of experimentation in the BBC, then we need to sort of make our mind up and run a channel. Actually, whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But there are no plans at the moment for a channel. But, Strictly was enormously successful. And if we keep choosing the right projects, I think that does sort of raise, the 3D head above the parapet as such.
Okay, there's a question here.
Just answered the question. Does the BBC perceive value in 3D?
We actually did an audience survey, and we got for the cinemas only, and it was really interesting to get some of those results back. It followed the HD route, actually, of, we asked people what would they like to watch in 3D. A lot of people said natural history, sport was pretty high up, music and events, and then entertainment, really. And then other questions that we had is, did you come to the cinema to watch Strictly or 3D? And 60% said they came to watch 3D. So it was quite a high figure because, I wasn't quite sure whether we'd get the BBC One audience wanting to go to the cinema, seeing it on a big screen. But there seemed to be a lot of people interested in the technology.
There's a question here.
Rachel, do you think that the BBC will be producing all of their own 3D in-house, or will be commissioning external providers?
I think they will be commissioning from external providers as well.
Are there any more questions for Rachel? Another one here.
It almost, I suppose, carries on from what you were saying about the BBC does perceive some value, but does it actually perceive, given where the sort of general market, and maybe the conversation is going to be in the next session, is there a future for 3D in the BBC?
Well, I suppose it's a bigger question than that. Is there a future for 3D outside of B-Sky B? I think we need, I mean, I've been talking to some productions at ITV about some 3D that they're doing later this year, and I've been really keen to share everything that we learned on Strictly and other shows that we're doing, because I think with ITV on board and other broadcasters, that will sort of add weight to the BBC continuing the 3D. But I think there needs to be a bigger push from everyone, really, on the 3D front. It can't just be Sky on its own.
Well, I think one of the interesting things you said as well is about comedy and drama, because that's not something that Sky are looking at. And I mean, why do you think those may be the areas that the BBC are looking at? It's not traditionally the 3D area.
Well, I think Sky have done a fair amount, but I think that children's drama and shows that maybe have quite a lot of visual effects in, and could really bring it to life through 3D. So I think there's a lot of interest in testing that out and seeing what the appetite is. So we've got a particular comedy drama in mind that's quite amusing, quite a big talent leading it, a lot of visual effects, and feels that it'd be quite good fun to do it in 3D.
There's a question at the back.
Sorry if I missed the earlier part of the session, so I apologise if this is information you've already given out. But you talk about the stuff that you're doing with the BBC being across different areas of the output, but which part of the BBC is it specifically that's driving the experimentation?
It's Kim Shillinglaw, who's head of 3D. She's also, I think, Commissioner for Science as well. And she's looking after commissioning 3D. But she is looking, across sport and gardening and cookery and, and I've been helping out on that front as well with her.
And
So it's not a big department.
And where are you based?
In TV Centre
TV Centre, okay.
for the moment.
Okay.
At the front.
Thank you. So the BBC was originally quoted some time ago as seeing 3D as a slight distraction from high definition. And given the Olympics, the BBC seemed to make a late call to shoot it in 3D, but they've been very, very vocal about super high vision, so 16 times HD quality. I'm just wondering where the BBC's main focus is. Do they see super high vision as being a long-term goal, and how does that compare to the 3D, which is probably easier to deliver given present?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting. It's an interesting point that super high vision is technology developed by NHK. It's the major innovation around the Olympics. It's something the BBC are in control of. There's only 3 cameras that are made at the moment, in fact, which are being shipped over about 2 weeks before the Games. And then they're putting sort of some screens across the UK. But it's a 15, 20-year out technology. I mean, I think in Japan they're expecting to be able to have the bandwidth to put it into homes in 2020, starting off then. I mean, it's big event. I think it's different from 3D in as much as, it's a big event kind of something that you watch. You choose where to look rather than allowing the director to cut for you. The 3D around the Olympics is actually being produced by OBS, so all the broadcasters have paid for the 3D. So it's not something the BBC are actually in total control of. But we are doing some 3D programming around the Olympics. But yeah, I mean, it does feel quite slow in many ways. But I mean, the whole Olympics is managed by OBS as well, so it's sort of quite a big press operation for the BBC.
I wonder if there are any more questions or if we should see a dance. Any more questions? Perhaps if we watch a bit of the dancing, then we can come back. I think it was beautiful, the dancing. I'm sure you'll all agree. It's fabulous 3D. I hope that you do it again next year. I think that would be amazing to see again. So you talked about one of the lessons you learned about rehearsal time and how you'd like more of that.
Yes.
If you are to do it again next year, what other lessons were learned?
Well, I mean, we would really try to squeeze in a little bit more extra rehearsal time, I think. I think it would be easier because actually the 3D was commissioned for Strictly when the actual 2D series had started. So I think if we get this year's off the ground, we'll get it off the ground before the main series. So it'll be sort of as one. Okay. I think what we'll try and do is make it kind of business as usual. So we'll put a production manager in there who'll just look after the 3D. So we'll probably manage the cinemas separately from the production, but just make it, rather than a separate operation, bring it together a bit more.
Okay. Unless there are any more questions, I think... we have. Yes, good.
Right. Based on that, a very complex, fast-moving live production being done in 2 and 3D, do you think there will ever be a day when 2D directors will be cutting in a manner that enables, instead of 2 OBs happening side by side, 1 OB to do it?
Well, good question. I might need a director to answer that. I think there are some productions that we could do from one truck, 2D and 3D, but I just think at the moment, when it's the biggest 2D show there is for BBC One, it's probably not going to happen. But I think ultimately, in some years down the road, when the rigs are easier, then potentially we could, yes. Maybe not for every show.
Yes, at the back.
Yes.
Just following on from the last question, is there no merit, therefore, in employing a 3D director to direct the 2D show?
I might have to ask Marcus to answer that.
I think Marcus is in the room.
He's up for it. If you come forward down just here. There he is. Put your hand.
Reluctantly.
Sorry, but you know.
I don't see a reason why not, if that's what you're asking, Julian. No, not at all. And I think, I guess, I mean, strictly as an example, Nikki Parsons, who directed the 2D, I worked really closely with her to basically try and make the most of the scripting she had done for her show, so that we basically were in sync as much as we could be. And I think that in that respect, we were fortunate that, as Rachel alluded to earlier, the Steadicam features heavily in Strictly. So by having that in 3D from the outset, that provided the basis of our 3D coverage in respect to the scripting. So it was then a case of working around, what the Steadicam was doing. But, I suppose at the end of the day, it comes down to, the cut rate at the end of the day. I don't think there's any problem with the coverage of the judges, of all the presenter pieces. No problem at all to have taken the 3D and to version the 2D from that. I think what would have to be overcome is the fact that if you followed the same cut pattern as you would in 3D, then one of those, the 2D would probably suffer because you'd end up with less cuts in your 2D show. So for your 13 million viewers who are watching in 2D, you would lose a number of cuts in each of those performance pieces. That said, I do think in general terms, convergence pulling in a live scenario is getting better and better. So I think, you certainly can upcut a bit more than you certainly used to be able to. So I think the difference between a 3D cut and a 2D cut, the margins are getting closer and closer. I think that would be the main thing that would have to be overcome, is the fact that you'd probably end up with a slightly slower paced 2D cut. And whether that would work for 2D, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of purists of dance would say they actually prefer to see more head-to-toe coverage and less cutaways. But I think for the majority of viewers, a lot of the scripting of the 2D cuts, it tells the story of the dance by the way it's scripted, and you get the detail of the close-up to see facial reactions, which wouldn't be quite so easy in 3D.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up soon, but if there's any final questions for Marcus? Nope. So thank you very much. It's a very interesting panel.